the target. I'm not going to read it. We have a variety of kind of assaultive speech, slurs, derogatory words, and the sort of usual go back to country. So what's going on here is, so we want to distinguish between, I think, what's next? Sorry.
Okay, I will.
So we want to distinguish between the harms, in particular the immediate and distal harms, or call it synchronic, what happens in the very here and now conversation. Yeah, and here you have direct harms on the target. Usually the function is to attack, assault, threaten, intimidate, provoke, silence, dehumanize, what have you. Then we have by proxy harms. Yeah, in the bus example, we have other white passengers. Some might be target sympathizers, and they feel silenced or drawn into unwanted social cognitive complicity, as Liz might want to put it. But we also have other by proxy harms, whereby in the bus there might be also some bystanders who have a predisposition to those, they would be bigots. So the function there would be one of recruiting and trying to get them on board. But again, the focus is what happens after that. So diachronic or distal harms beyond the conversation. And here you can think of like just normalizing the harmful conduct practices by promoting, justifying violence, legitimating, and what have you. So the next type of example we look at is, again, another example from Mary Kay McGowan in the locker room, which came up yesterday. Bob refers to Sue in a conversation with John by saying that very utterance, I'm not going to say it. But what you have here is a sort of like in terms of the synchronic harms, even though the target is not there, a participant, is not present, there is this kind of potential of incubating her hate, and which will later scale up. So you have building in group identity, you have solidarity, bonding between the two males. But again, the focus is on the diachronic harms. What happens when John meets Sue later on and speaks to her? Clearly, he might now treat Sue with less respect before. So the first conversation had an effect on the second one. And you might carry on this sort of in a network effect. You have future interactions, including some of the old and new participants that were not initially present in the conversation. So it's this kind of propagation of the harm that we're interested in. The third case is policing talk. And here we can think, I have the cases that Kate Munn discusses, misogynistic, men using gender slurs, but also you have the women using gender slurs. And that can also be in parallel with other in-group uses of slurs, whereby, you know the cases. So what happens here, you have a selective target based on behavior rather than group membership. So the function here, as I see it, as one of kind of warning signal. You're trying to put the target in a place, that will be sort of a direct harm, but you also warn off against would-be violators of those norms. So here it is that you want policing the boundaries of the in-group and out-group to maintain the status quo and reinforce, normalize oppressive norms. And so here is we can rephrase the initial puzzle as to we want an explanation as to how to move from step one, from conversational structure and dynamics, to step two, how those conversational effects will reverberate into future social interactions and they shift norms here. And just to kind of recap what we need from the first three cases that we discussed. So we need to in accounting for the conversational dynamics, which will be our focus here, the first building block is what we need is elements that can capture changes in mood, changes in power that will affect the relationship between participants, both social, emotional, but also changes in permissibility rules for specific conversations. Yes, if you think of the weaponized talk, we have an asymmetry in mood and power, which will kind of will affect what the target can say and do next. And we will also change permissibility for bystanders. In solidarity talk, you can think that there is an equal power. Yeah, both are from the same, let's say, in-group, but perhaps there is a heightened mood. One is, and they might feel emboldened later on to carry on in with sexist behavior. And so with the policing talk, you have an asymmetry in power and mood, in virtue of group membership, but you can also, you can think, I mean, the cases that really fascinate me is women, misogynistic women using gender slurs, and you can think there is a power, asymmetry power in virtue of group membership, but there is this sort of, we need something more. We need to track alliances. So that can trump considerations about in-group identity in order to kind of enforce this sexist norms. All those cases, depending on the strength of the policing norm and the enforcement of the norms, so you will always have kind of new permissibility emerging in future interactions. So just to kind of give you a hook to what we need to track sensitivity of participants type and the various coalitions that might be in. So here is a quick, just abstract representation. We need those two components. We need an oppressive conversational game and an oppressive social games. Clearly, one is actually part of another, and this is the picture that Mary-Kate will develop, but I just want to keep them as abstract entities. So what you have here is that you have kind of this feedback loop between the two. In one direction, what goes on in conversation depends on background conditions of oppressive structures and norms already operating in the social game. And in the other direction, when we move back to the, so what we do or fail to do in conversation can alter future kind of social structures and norms, creating in turn future conditions for future conversations. So it's this feedback loop that basically maintains the oppressive norms and institutions and makes them endure. And then is an answer, how to account, next one, how to account for this kind of feedback loop that Mary-Kate McGowan develops in basically using kind of this picture. We have a conversation embedded in a larger social game. And what happens in the first step, the conversation, is that by uttering making an oppressive move, you enact score change in the conversational game, and in parallel, you kind of shift conversational norms. I just very simply, there's more technical machinery needed here, but for the purposes, to keep it short, I'm just calling those ZAS norms, specific norms for the conversation. In the second step, what you do is that those permissibility have changed within the conversation, then they will enact the score change in the social game, and in parallel, you have a shift in social norms, call them the general norms of social norms. I think my minor worry, I mean, we are kind of on a similar page. I think the only sort of concern I have, and I should have mentioned that, so the idea is that the slurring utterance is a move into simultaneous game. And it's fine if you think that the conversation is a social interaction, if you have also this subset of a larger social game. But I think that, anyway, the way I'm thinking is, the worry that I have is, how do we move from, let's say, from one conversation to future conversations where that utterance is not yet a move, and in particular, speakers might not necessarily be present there. So here is our proposal. The way we look is to sort of have this indeed two steps move. First, to account for the conversational dynamics, where we track changes in the dynamics of mood, power, alliances, and the specific conversation. And this is what Jonathan will talk about, the game dialogue game board. And the second step is to explain this long-term interactional structure, in particular, how we kind of keep track of the memory and the outcomes of specific conversations embedded as conversational episodes and long-term memory. So for this, we will need a sort of hierarchical and even network model that will capture how new future conversations with a mix of old and new participants can reconstruct the final states of the previous conversations. And Jonathan will go more into the details of this. But first, just let me see the time. very quickly, so we have kind of the pragmatic picture of what the conversational structure should track. And so think of conversations as events, limited in space and time. It can be open-ended. You meet one person, you start a conversation with someone today, you might meet them next week, and so on. It may branch in time and medium and so on. I think an interesting question we have to have a good handle on is who counts as players? And this comes in particular when you think about silencing and complicity and stuff like that. So it's important, I think, to distinguish between kind of active players who you would expect that they are kind of, you expect them to make a move because they are kind of count as players, but you also have bench players like all the bystanders that kind of, they weren't addressed, are they part of the conversation or are they not? All sorts of questions that will, as I said, are very important when we talk about society. So quickly, players make moves, conversational rules change, they update the game state, and that changes the future permissible moves. Very kind of standard updating dynamics. Also think that conversations are norm-governed activities, and there are the usual kind of principles that will kind of be in place in terms of rationality of cooperation and so on. But those can also be exploited strategically, and in particular when we deal with oppressive conversational games, that logic doesn't apply. That's a logic of conflict, where as it were, all the nice principles are hijacked. But more important for us here is the fact that we have so conversations are governed by social norms. Yeah, and by this I mean that we index social norms, because a conversation is a token instantiating an interactional type. And that enables kind of participants to bring a lot of kind of inferential default scripts, roles, and conventionalized move. And so our idea is to classify interactions into dimensions, the activity type and sensitivity to the social participant type. And the idea here would be to capture the socially driven structures by adding additional constraints or participants and socially driven rules. And here, the next element that we need is the idea of roles. So to capture the sensitivity of social participants, we need social roles. And social role is a very powerful idea. It's a know-how. It helps us navigate social interactions, and we can be, more or less fluent, more or less strategic in the way we manipulate those social roles. And they're powerful because they index things like belief, attitudes, norms. If I tell you Gavin is a neurosurgeon, you will have lots of beliefs about how he behaves in his role, probably attitudes and norms about how he should behave and so on. And people can hold multiple roles at the same time, which are, and which one is relevant in a particular interaction or conversation depends on context. If I tell you that Gavin is a Nazi, say you will have different beliefs and attitudes and norms, expectations, and so on about him. But because we're interested in oppression, what matters is power relations and hierarchies. And power can be justified, unjustified, but what matters here is that once you kind of make changes in the social roles, power relations can change with that. So like if one is declared a criminal in a court law, then various things will change. Now we move on to the next one, conversational roles. So social roles can also influence conversation. So when we enter a conversation, we import contextually relevant social roles, which then become the initial conversational roles. So in a conversation, we typically inherit, we have this kind of role import from the social game into the conversation according to the context, depending on what contextual features make it salient. But the relevant role can change during the conversation or as a result of what is said. So when you take on or you're assigned a conversational role, it affects what is said about you, what you can say or are expected to say, and how that will be interpreted. So it's kind of this kind of feeding in and out of salience that can change the conversation, and thus will change the norms and power relations associated with those roles. So now it's, what do we have? But we also have we can assign roles in a conversation. So you may not have had a role as part of your long-term social role, but I'm just assigning to you in this very conversation. So that's what we call a role assignment. And just let's see how it works for, and then there's the idea that it will be kind of accommodated and will change localized shifts in conversation and norms. So the next one is, how does it apply to Slur? The idea here is that to look at Slur as a move, a power grab in conversation. So it seeks to achieve and maintain a power imbalance in conversation, and it does this by assigning roles. Speaker takes on a dominant role, assigns a target a subordinate role, and that kind of imbalance between the role will change the power dynamics in the conversation. Clearly, that will kind of piggyback on history, on kind of historical power imbalances. But what matters is that if it's accommodated, this change will change the conversational dynamics by giving the speaker more power. So there will be a lot to say when we come to resistance or acceptance. I'm not going to go spend a lot of time on that. So clearly you can have resistance, and you can have a kind of active pushback. Ray Langton talks a lot about blocking. Many other people talk about counter speech and so on. It doesn't work when the target, trying to issue a counter move, in a way, precisely because by assigning them a low power role, it's kind of built in that they are kind of silenced. They don't, and it's a. But they could kind of engage in defiant silence, what Alexander Tennessini talks about, and I think that could work well from targets or bystanders. And clearly there will be different weights and the updating the dynamics depend on whether or not they count as a player. We can come to that in Q&A. Just very quickly, resistance is always more costly than accommodation. So people just tend to go along because there will be lots of costs. And so here you would need to bring in some machinery in terms of rewards and costs, but we don't have time for that. So just to quickly kind of finish the dynamics that we have. So we move on. Once the role is accommodated, it changes the conversational dynamics. Next move is an attempt to go back into the social role, so what we call the role export. So, and here is, once this will be, basically it will be an updating of people's beliefs and so on. So here we account for the diachronic distal effects, in later conversations, because the norms have shifted in the social game, then that will make it more permissible in future interactions. The next one, to sort of, that would make it possible for the role to be imported in future conversations. And yeah, I think I may have taken quite a lot of time. So I will I'll hand over to Jonathan to explain the more formal framework, embedding it in a framework of dialogue.
Okay, thank you very much, Michaela. So basically, here's some basic data that we want from a framework to account for this. One is that in contrast to, everybody's been mentioning this Lewisian picture, but actually we somewhat diverge from that in the sense of taking a view of a conversational school where each person has actually their own version of the school, something that we're calling the dialogue game board. Following a lot of work that's been done in people in dialogue. We need some way of talking about power dynamics within some notion of what we'll call appraisal dynamics. We will classify interactions from as Michael said, from two dimensions. We won't talk about that so much now, given time considerations. And in the end, we'll talk a little bit about long-term effects by embedding dialogue game boards into long-term memory. So dialogue game boards, in this framework of cost that has been developed over the last, by now quite a lot of years, 25 years or so, the idea is that there's no single context, there's no single score, if you will, but analysis is formulated at the level of cognitive states, one per conversational participant. So this is how it looks in terms of, there's many things that get kept track of. There's a sort of fields that track the turn ownership, the familiar shared assumptions, but there's also tracking the visual field, which is something that is never exactly the same for distinct interlocutors, right? They don't have the same pair of eyes. And usually in a conversation, in fact, they have each other as the focus of their attention. So that's already one source of divergence, but of course they can align by pointing, for instance. And another important field that's tracked, in particular, important for the current purposes, is a field that we call mood. These are all types. This is in a type theoretic framework called type theory with records, for those of you who are familiar with this framework. So the mood tracks essentially the public face of each particular interlocutor. Now, in order to capture emotional effects in parallel with the locutionary ones, we're integrating emotion theories like the Scherer's component process model, or Russell and Feldman-Barrett's, with these kind of cognitive states. And the basic idea is that mood is some kind of a weighted sum of appraisals. So the mood represents the publicly accessible emotional aspect of an agent that arises by publicly visible actions, such as nonverbal social signals. It can, but doesn't have to diverge from the private emotional state, just like the beliefs that we seem to be taking publicly don't have to be the same as the ones we really have. So that's the notion of like a fake smile is one that doesn't actually reflect general pleasure. So without, I mean, the details are here and I can go into them later for those who are interested, but the basic structure of an appraisal is in terms of three basic dimensions: pleasantness, who's responsible for the current state, and some notion of power. And the pleasure is again keeping track of some notion of arousal, which can be at the same time both positive and negative. If it's both, then that gives rise to essentially what is sometimes called a mixed emotion. And this is basically a subsymbolic kind of representation. So it's a kind of numerical thing that gets updated in terms of some kind of operations that I'll come back to later if I have a little bit of time, because the actual technical details probably are not too crucial for us at the moment. And so basically, yeah, so these are the kind of the basic subsymbolic operations for updating the various components of the mood dimension. Now, and here's an example that I can come back to later if you want me to, if we have time. We're just a little bit short time, so I'm going a little bit faster on this part. So now to illustrate this, why we need this, for instance, apart from before we get into slurs, we've been working on laughter for a few years, and arguing that laughter has both descriptive and emotive effects. So for instance, this is an example that my host here in Berlin, I guess, possibly familiar with, in the sense of, this is an example of a use of laughter to basically communicate a negation. So this is a case where the Bayern München goalkeeper was asked after his team's rather unsuccessful game whether the three in the back defense was an option, and his response was to laugh, in thereby communicating that it wasn't. Okay, so the laugh actually communicated something like a no. Or by the same token, laughter can actually, for instance, be used to affect scare quoting, for instance. So in examples like, well, I'm interested in a comfortably relaxed way. So in that sense, in that case, the laughter actually is doing something just at a sub-utterance level, and it can actually its placement can actually affect the scope of what counts as the scare quote. So we assume that laughter has two basic meanings. One where it's expressing pleasure for the speaker is some laughable element P is causing pleasure for the speaker, and the other meaning is that the laughter is that this laughable element, some event, is incongruous relative to some topos that is giving the notion of congruity. Okay, so that's all as a kind of a motivation for having both sort of propositional elements in the updates, but also at the same time emotive elements in our updating. So we have two types of ways of changing our dialogue game boards, which so we characterize dialogue regularities in terms of conversational rules, which are mappings between two current states, which we capture in terms of some notion of preconditions and effects. So these kind of states, like we saw before, these are our conversation, our dialogue game boards. All of these fields potentially different actions can update any of them depending on what the action actually is. Yes, so conversational rules can come in two basic flavors. Either rules that apply to all of the interlocutors in the same way. So these are what we call participant neutral rules. Or rules that are specified only for particular interlocutors. So these are what we might call participant sensitive rules. So for instance, this one rule we have is that if an utterance is currently pending, so there's an utterance that is just perceived before having been actually grounded, then a participant has the right to update their score with what did the other participant mean by that utterance, and thereby causing a divergence between the dialogue game boards of the two participants. Another sort of very straightforward kind of CUD rule is that given that a question has been asked, then we can update the CUD with either with a question or if it's an assertion with a corresponding polar question. And the example of a conversation of a participant sensitive rule is the positive affect incrementation of mood. So for instance, if somebody's just laughed, thereby communicating what we call an incongruity proposition, then the laugher increments their pleasantness to an extent that's determined by the laughter's arousal value. Now, of course, that update is not one that they can force on the other participants. So this is a participant sensitive kind of update rule. And this sort of setup allows us to give a theory of meaning for various kinds of very context-dependent elements, such as non-sentential utterances, like yes, that are resolved relative to the CUD, acknowledgements that are back channels that are resolved relative to the element that's maximal in pending. Filled pauses like which communicate basically, like I'm doing now, an issue, a question about what is going to be the next word after the current word, and laughs that I've already mentioned. So now we get to how we can actually represent a slur. So here's a lexical entry for a slur. And a slur here, we're representing it in terms of three basic fields. One is its phonological form. It's of a certain type. These are the contextual parameters. the dialogue game board parameters, and this is its content. So its content is it's predicating of some individual or group, some property G, which is presupposed to be in some way problematic. There also has to be a presupposition that the slur word form has to have some bad history. Now, crucially, the speaker, right? This is the speaker and the addressee. X is the speaker, Y is the addressee at some utterance time. So this is the basic condition of the basic relation of being speaker addressee relation. But simultaneous with the uttering, we're assuming that there's also what one might call a humiliation action by the speaker of the target of the slur. Okay, so that's happening at the same time as they're making that utterance. Two actions are happening, a sort of a pure locutionary one and this social action. What this, so this is, so for instance, one thing that this derives relative to a question that was asked about self-slurring, for instance, is that on this picture, self-slurring is self-humiliation. And at the same time, humiliation can be mitigated or canceled by irony, for instance, if the speaker has the right to do so. So the idea is that, for instance, exactly what laughter, one of the things that laughter does is that we often use laughter to cancel, the seriousness of what we're saying, right? Oh no, I don't mean this, right? So at the same, or smiling is a slightly more low-rise version of a laugh. So therefore, we would assume that a story about in-group uses of slurs would be a case where there's some attempt, for instance, to mitigate this basic condition. And we would assume that typically that's those kind of uses require this, or else there's something kind of difficult about them, as we know that they're not so trivial actually. Okay, so we don't have too much more time, too much longer, I guess. But so okay, so associated with this basic lexical entry for slur is a conversational rule that for the social conversational act of humiliation, and the basic idea is that it's a perspectival conversational rule, so that the humiliator's rule, it increments their power and their positive pleasantness, and the target's rule is assuming that they're sort of that they collaborate, is that their power is decremented and their negative pleasantness is incremented. So I just in terms of the basic responses that can occur to things like both laughter and slurs in this respect, is that a response to a laughter, well, if I'm laughing about something, that conveys that laughable is incongruous. So the person I'm laughing, my interlocutor can accept this move, for instance, by laughing, and so affirming that it's incongruous, or verbally, yeah, right, weird. They can disagree, so they can, for instance, say that's not funny, and they can, since incongruous laughter typically is not so obvious what necessarily what you're laughing about or why, it can give rise to clarification questions. Or to frowns, which again can be analyzed in similar kind of terms. In similar kind of terms, we can talk about the reactions to slurs in this setup. So they can be accepted by nods or back channels, in which case the slur as a characterization of the target is established, and their use is kind of taken to be reasonable. They can lead to discussion where, for instance, the issue of what the speaker meant by using that word can be raised for discussion and rejected, as can any word. They can be blocked, and they can also be opting out, where A withdraws after this discussion. So the discussion begins, and either one side, so A can, for instance, withdraw chastened, or they remain conflict on this point. So their scores are not going to be the same in this way. Okay, so I think we're sort of short of time for the Q&A to go both into our theory of conversational types. So I think I'll skip that for now. And I will very, very briefly just take 2 minutes to talk about the long-term stuff, if that's okay. So the basic idea, as far as embedding dialogue game boards in memory, this is based on some work that I did with ongoing with Andy Luking, presented in the recent CEMDAL conference last year. So the question is, how can we ensure that the mechanisms we use for dialogue states, how do they fit into memory? How can we ensure that they represent records of interaction? So the basic idea is, as Michaela said before, to view each conversation as an episode, one which gets initialized by the first move, typically a greeting, and concluded by the final move. So each conversation is a particular class of episode, which dialogue game boards provide structure for within episodic memory. And then the question becomes how to partition the various components of the dialogue game board across working memory and long-term memory. Again, the details for current purposes, and I guess we don't really have time for them, but and the various interesting questions about how to do it, particularly for both the working memory part and the long-term memory part. But I'll kind of skip most of that, just to say that the basic, okay, so that's the episodic part, that's the working memory part, which you're not interested in for now. The long-term memory structure, basically, we can think of as having three fields. One is the basic episodic component. One is some kind of representation of entities, the entities that a particular individual keeps track of, and these two can be dissociated. And this is basically some kind of notion of semantic memory, various sorts of procedures that even if we lose a fair bit of this, this is usually kind of retained. So I'm not, again, for reasons of time, unless you're interested, and I can go back into this if you're interested, this is the basic setup of both working memory and long-term memory of dialogue game board. But just as a tiny application of this, let's say we have this chat where A is saying, how can we solve the equation? And B says, I'll have to think about it, but I now have to run. And then they meet again after 3 days. So A can say, so where were we? Right, yes, I just say integrate 3 times and, right? So somehow, bang, this initial conversation, and so the initial conversation ends with a non-empty cut with some question that was not resolved. And the initial utterance in the subsequent conversation makes reference to the previous conversation. So we look for it in the as an episode in the interlocutor's long-term memory, and kind of bring up that episode to the extent that we can. Obviously, there's the issues of exactly how we do this recollection operation, but essentially we've reset up the context, and we can use it, for instance, to resolve a nonsense tender utterance like we have here. Okay, so we're kind of really 5 minutes above where we should be, but just to conclude what we were trying to say, we were kind of arguing that slur uses involve some sort of simultaneous, some utterances that at the same time involve some kind of a social act at the same time, which we cashed out in terms of these asymmetric power updates on the interlocutor's mood, and the long-term effects by embedding the dialogue game boards, which are participant-specific conversation scores, in long-term memory. Okay.
Thank you. So now the floor is open for questions, and we'll try. So yeah, if you're a junior scholar, please preface QJ, and we'll give you priority. But yeah, put the questions in the chat. Okay, Mary Kate.
Hi. Thank you for that. It's very interesting. I have a question for you about individuation. How committed are you to saying that these are separate conversations rather than the conversation continues at a later time? And you mentioned in the beginning that distinguishing between the conversation as an activity and broader social practices as an activity, and really the conversation is within the social. So you're pulling conversation out of social context to talk about conversation in particular, like I do, but I really see conversation as a social activity. And when you contribute to a conversation, you're changing the score of the conversation, but you're also contributing to a social interaction and changing the score of the social interaction. So
Yes.
Is the worry that you have about what change. So I've stressed how the social is affecting the conversation, and you're saying, and it's going the other way. I totally agree. And so you want to track how it's going the other way and how those effects affect the future, like downstream. But I'm just wondering if you're treating them as different conversations, and you're treating conversation as different from the social, is making things harder for you than it needs to be, if you understand what.
Yes, no, I'm totally, and I like, I'm on the same page, and that's why I sort of said that the picture is just kind of an abstract representation, to sort of think of them as abstract, as different entities, but obviously one is an instance of another. A conversation is a token instantiation of a social interaction. So everything I mean, they're all part of the social game.
That's
and
right.
You can move from different token instantiations, and they can be branched and sort of, yeah, with different people, different time, or what have you, sort of network effect. They're all part of the social game. It's as if, like, yeah, the social game is the ground zero on which everything is taking place, and it's sort of providing those conditions for whatever we do with language to kind of take an effect. I think indeed that there's no difference, huge difference between us, and I think in a way I mean, it's just a technicality, I guess. It's in the sense that I do agree, yeah, with the same move being simultaneous a move in those two games, because insofar as conversation is part of the larger game. I think somehow, yeah, when we think about this distancing effect, when we move from a conversation and then that person goes and talks to someone else and so on, where we don't have the same kind of configuration of the participants and so on. So it's that kind of spreading effect. And I know that for you, in a way, like whatever we do in this here and now conversation, it will kind of update the social norms, and then they will provide new conditions for future interactions. So it's like all the time kind of this updating motoring of the social norms. Yeah, I think it's just a matter. Yeah, I guess I see it as a sort of technical way of representing. I think the point I want to make, it's to do with this what counts as a move, and so the way I want to think about it is look at the effects, the outcome of this here and now conversation, and how it kind of goes back into the social norm. It's not just the particular move that will have effects in the future conversations where perhaps the speaker is not the participant anymore, and so on. So it's, I think that's where I want to draw, is like get that kind of gist of that specific conversations, and then kind of slowly strengthen the social norms, and then move on to others and so on. So it's kind of a way of kind of keeping track of this kind of fine-tuning at every level, but we are on the same page, and I just, yeah, it's
Thank you.
So I guess, yeah, I'm having to, who's next? David.
Hi, thank you for the talk, and it's a very exciting direction. I just wanted to ask what you thought about questions, let's say from the point of view of the hearer, but we could ask this on the other side too. questions of intention on the speaker side, but also in terms of the reaction of the hearer. Let's just focus on the hearer. Intention and freedom to choose a reaction. You kind of hinted at some points where there was choice, but let's think about the laughter case or the slur case. So if you laugh along with someone, is clearly it's possible to do so intentionally. And you mentioned cases of faking of insincere laughs and smiles, but it doesn't seem to be necessarily something where the standard view of intentionality in action is necessarily a good match for what's happening, where I don't want to say there's no choice. And when you use the expression, for example, his laughter fell on deaf ears, and I think one of the interactions you described felt like this, that suggests having already a kind of disposition not to empathize, rather than deciding at that point, I don't think I'll laugh with this guy. I don't appreciate her humor. And I think one could say the same about the effects of slurs, whether one feels them. Sure, the slur could fall on deaf ears, but how much choice does one have? So I think the reason I'm asking is really because I get asked this all the time and get accused of having a completely non-intentional picture, which is not my aim at all. So I'm sort of very sympathetic to the fact that you didn't really say a lot about intention and freedom of choice here. So do you have any comments?
Yeah, I'm not sure which of us should take this on. I should probably give it to Michaela so that I can have it easy. I think in general with, people tend to think, for instance, for laughter, that the people's kind of basic intuition is that laughter is kind of, some people's intuition. You don't have much choice about it. That a lot of it is just kind of spontaneous, and it's very different from language where you intend things. You make it. And I think that, in both directions, it's not quite right, in the sense that, a lot of the utterances we make are not really kind of instinctive, in the sense of, my pen falls down from the table and I say shit, right? That's kind of, I don't even notice that I said it. I'm in class and I'm in front of my students and I said shit, right? Which is good because they hear me pronounce it, for French students, they learn how to pronounce shit well, but anyway, so that's that, or I come to a foreign country and I'm not yet attuned to speaking that language, and I speak the language of the of the country I came from, right? So again, that's a kind of a language use which is sort of semi-free in terms of how free I am in terms of what action I'm doing. With laughter, some of the time you can control it, some of the time you can't control it, and some of the time, you can sort of, stop yourself. If I'm not gonna laugh at what you're saying, even though I kind of find it funny, but I'm gonna really try and resist because I don't want you to get any kind of cash by saying this is a funny guy, right? So, yeah, I guess I'm not sure if I'm getting at what you really want or not.
You're getting at the fact that it's a difficult issue, and the reason why it matters is partly because there's a certain view of the kind of meaning NN view of what's going on in communication, and if you allow that there's some gradients of intention where, to some extent my word choice when I was speaking was inadvertent, and to some extent, there's cross-cutting issues of consciousness of what one does and intentionality, but to the extent that the only things that matter on one model are the meaning NN intention recognition bits, it's like once you get even into kind of contested territory about what was intentional and what wasn't, that is really problematic for that picture. Even if you say, it's right in these cases, but look, now we've got into some mess, and that kind of, it wasn't clear to me what you were committed to in terms of intention recognition. You didn't talk about it, so I presume you weren't particularly. So I guess I could re-ask the question, does it matter to you how intentional any of this is?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm trying to say that these things are kind of more or less on similar kind of levels. That's or not radically different, at least. Yeah, they're pretty. I mean, certainly with respect to laughter, that it's kind of integrated in the same kind of mechanisms as verbal stuff. And I guess a slur is a verbal thing. So yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, also with slurs, obviously, when I say that, then, you know, it was a humiliation act, a lot of these slurs, you know, when they're being used kind of, you know, without too much thought, then, you know, people are just used to kind of, you know, I mean, particularly with kind of misogynistic kind of stuff, you know, that broad or whatever, right? It's not necessarily being, you know, kind of really against women in that situation. He's just kind of person who's been in you know, around people who kind of, you know, are easy with this kind of stuff, even though it's, you know, in the general picture, that's what is associated. So yeah, I don't think it's always, not all of it is kind of, not all of the ingredients are necessarily always there.
That echoes the defense. I'll leave it here, but echoes the defense. I didn't mean to say anything offensive. I didn't mean to harm any.
Yeah, I mean, that there is a very complex issue, and in a way, I'm sort of very sympathetic to Mary-Kate McGann's picture, whereby in a way, whatever we do with those oppressive speech, kind of it can go beyond, you know, our intentions. It need not be acknowledged by participants and so on. There's just kind of have that kind of power in the words beyond speakers' intention. Clearly, speakers do use them most of the time with intention, but sometimes you all have all those cases, you know, the naive uses, any other uses, the sort of inadvertent harm that you know, precisely because that kind of heavy weight of the power of the word, it is in the word, and kind of can trump even speakers' intentions. So that's a very tricky. Yeah, so we have Gillian, sorry. Hi.
Hey. So I'm really hungry for an answer to the question that I understood Michaela to be articulating at the beginning, which is something like, how do we get from like changing norms within a conversation to changing social norms more generally? And one of the things that made me wonder is like how big a conversation can get. Like sort of paradigm case is a few people talking in the same room, but then sometimes people talk about like the national conversation, or like they might make moves like publishing op-eds or the prime minister giving a speech, or like certain things might be regarded as a contribution to the national conversation. Then you wonder, is that really a conversation, or is that just a metaphor that we use to talk about this? And I actually wondered whether some of the work that was being done at the end, some of Jonathan's work, could help answer that question. Like, is that really a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, this is really, and this is where the work really needs to get, you know, to really, you know, get our sleeves and really formalize those, that kind of variety of configurations, and who actually counts as a player, who is in the audience. And yeah, you have a kind of national, you know, TV broadcast, you have online communications, you have, sometimes you don't even know who's in the audience, and sort of, for me, and that varies, because that very dynamics between who speaks to whom and who else happens to be in the audience and so on will determine you know, a variety of effects. So for me, yeah, you need to capture that dynamics, and then not only the physical, who's the speaker, who's the addressee, who's the bystander, and so on. Then you have, like, on top of that, you have each one's group membership, and then how they, you know, are we in group, are we out group, how do we kind of delineate the various divisive coalitions in a particular conversation? But I think the difficulty is indeed of kind of delineating the limits, and as Mary Kay put it, the individuation of the conversation, and in particular when you start one day with meeting John, and then I meet him in a year. Are we we restart a conversation that was like so long ago? Is it still the same conversation? In a sense, you might think yes. Why not? But it's kind of all this kind of new, new ways of kind of thinking how to, but clearly it is precisely because in a way they're so intertwined. I mean, they're clearly social interactions. There's nothing more to a conversation than just saying, here's an instantiation, a token of, but because I think I think the tool that I like is to think about this interactional types that will bring all that kind of structure, the default that and then every instantiation of a conversation will then fill in with different contextual parameters, that kind of default structure. But yeah, it's I mean, and there's even further complications. Is you can have like a primary conversations with someone, and then you have some other subsidiary, in the periphery with others. Would you think it's in a way, it's interesting. It's hard because you would have to track the effects of each of these different interaction, conversations, whether it's primary, secondary, perhaps other people who might be bystanders, but you are not aware, and all those things will matter. And clearly, in a way, they are part of the social game. But they may bring in sort of different inputs from the effects in each one, and will alter what's possible next, because that's what we wanted to draw, like, how they change the permissibility for future interactions. And so that's the project, to keep track of that complexity.
Okay, thanks.
So I see comment from Chris Davis. Eric Acton's paper, Sociophonetics, Semantics, okay, good, thank you. So if we have just 1 minute left, if there are any comments, questions. Jonathan, sorry, I haven't, if you want to
yeah, no, I mean, I think, it's a very difficult question, actually. I mean, that we know in the current situation, for instance, the whole COVID crisis and stuff like that, that's kind of channeled us in a certain way, that we're kind of, we have this, for instance, these leaders that we're kind of supposed to follow their, what's happening today, what have they said, what have they decided, we kind of have to be more, we're kind of much more structured in the sense, and what the topic is. Well, the topic is, what do we do tomorrow, or what's changed, right? Which are less in time, and these, I guess, are things that are typical of events like wars and epidemics and so on, where there's a kind of a fairly clear sort of issues that arising out of changes in the sort of here in the very actual out there situation, which is, we have illusions that these things exist less in, in times of supposedly, where things are more smooth, when in fact, that's a kind of, I guess, things that are good for people, for the sort of like the status quo, people who are pleased with the status quo, then they think like, no, everything is just normal. There's no change, no things to discuss somehow, which, is much clearer in situations of crisis, of overt crisis, shall we say. But yeah, it's
yeah.
So I think the issues of what you're discussing are kind of more clear. How to be, what you can say exactly, and I mean, and you can be accused of you're not following what they've just said. So that's a kind of, yes, yeah. But I mean, sort of individuating which discussions you're part of is obviously a difficult thing. But it is clear that there is memory. There is a lot of work on the fact that we have very fine-grained memory for which conversation we had with whom. And so that's pretty crucial.
That sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, but I also think another feature that is really critical in the individuation problem is indeed establishing who are players in the game, and because that establishes rights and obligations in a much more clear way than, for instance, you have like eavesdroppers or bystanders. They're like, okay, are they part of the conversation? I don't know, but will they have the same rights as someone who I'm addressing?
There's even something a bit like silencing. So if you think of the people who are in the Occupy movement as like promoting, contributing to the national conversation in a certain way, a lot of people turn around and say, what are their demands? I don't understand their demands. And they make a list and everyone's like, what are their demands? I don't understand their demands. And it's like one of their contributions just gets totally ignored.
Yeah. But in a way, it's kind of thinking, and then this is something that I started thinking with Laura when we started thinking about undoing and blocking and so on. It's sort of, you think that, you it's like, who's supposed to accommodate? Is it merely the target? And then you can sort of think whether it's sort of whatever the slurring move is an invitation for them to accept the low power role, or it's the sort of, clearly it's the sort of forced move. You're not inviting them to accommodate. It's sort of more like, But what happens with the bystanders? In a sense, you sort of think, okay, they keep silent, but are they players? It's sort of, you think it's sort of a more trivial accommodation insofar as they haven't said anything. Perhaps they could have, but did they have the right? Or did you expect them to have the right to say something? And it's I think, for me, it sort of plays there, like how to define who counts as a player, and maybe that's one way to sort of circumnavigate the limits of the conversation. But obviously, so far as sort of they kind of develop in time and interact with other social interactions. It's just very, very tricky to particularly to formalize, but clearly we need a good handle on that.
Thank you.
So I think, there was no other questions. So I think we reconvene in 6 minutes, I'm afraid, just to keep on track.